So today's shir will have two parts to it. One part will finish up what we started the last few weeks, actually, about chinuch. So I found something very interesting in the Rambam. And the second half will be about mikra. We'll see what that means in a few minutes. So first of all, what I found in the Rambam is that consistently, with only very, very few exceptions, but by far the largest majority of cases, when the Rambam codifies the obligation of chinuch, he adds three words. He'll tell you that the child reached this age and he has to be taught and prepared to do the mitzvos. And then the Rambam adds, Kidei lechancho b'mitzvos. And one wonders why the Rambam felt compelled to add these three words time after time after time. The fact that the Rambam in every single mitzvah will formulate the chiyuv chinuch, that doesn't bother me. Because every mitzvah, and we discussed this at great length in the past, has its own unique flavor and rules that govern chinuch. At what point is the child ready for chinuch? Every mitzvah is different. But once we understand the principle of chinuch, why does the Rambam feel compelled to repeat himself time after time, kidei lechancho b'mitzvos? Now, we have a second question to ask on the Rambam, which again I discovered recently, is that in a few cases of mitzvos, the Rambam doesn't discuss the father at all. He drops the chiyuv of the father completely and totally focuses on the chiyuv of the child himself. For example, in Hilchos Tefillah, Perek Vav Halacha Yud, the Rambam writes, Noshim va'avadim uktanim chayovim b'tefillah. The child is obligated in tefillah. The Rambam has the same kind of formulation with regard to Birkas HaMazon, and he writes, Tanim chayovim b'Birkas HaMazon. It would seem, therefore, that the Rambam must have some sort of category of mitzvos, the members of which the chiyuv chinuch shifts from the father to the son, to the child. We have it in tefillah, and we have it in Birkas HaMazon. What's that all about? Why are we shifting the mitzvah of chinuch from the father to the son? So what I'd like to suggest is the following. The Rambam wants to point out, by adding kidei lechancho b'mitzvos, that there's a general obligation called chinuch, which gives the mitzvah the status of chinuch. Let me explain what I mean. The pasuk says in Mishlei, Chanoch linar al pi darko, and that's the source for chinuch. when the child actually implements the mitzvah as chinuch, he's not fulfilling that particular mitzvah, but rather he's fulfilling the mitzvah of chinuch. Having said that, in certain specific cases, we can meticulously be medayik from the language of the Rambam that the child is fulfilling that particular mitzvah, not the mitzvah of chinuch as a general, all-inclusive mitzvah klolis, but rather that specific mitzvah. And moreover, in those cases where the katan is fulfilling that particular mitzvah, the Rambam shifts the chiyuv from the father to the son. So kol zman the mitzvah generates a chiyuv on the father to teach his son, that's called chinuch. And that's a general mitzvah of chinuch. I mean, l'saber ta'ozen, if you would make a bracha, the bracha would not be al mitzvah tzitzis, but rather it would be al mitzvah chinuch. So the father's obligation is not tzitzis, it's chinuch. Chinuch means to prepare the child so that he could fulfill all his mitzvahs when he becomes bar mitzvah. So now he's a child, prepare him so that it doesn't, hit him like a ton of bricks when he becomes bar mitzvah. Wow, I got to learn all these mitzvahs. No, he's already being trained. So the mitzvah of training the child is a general mitzvah called chinuch. And that obligation is incumbent upon the father. But in certain specific mitzvos, we're medayik in the Lashon Rambam that this is not chinuch in the sense of a general all-encompassing obligation imposed on the father, but rather the mitzvah itself, as a separate mitzvah, generates a chiyuv. Again, it's only derabanan, because the child is not a bar mitzvah, so he can't be chayav min Torah, but the child now becomes chayav midrabanan in that mitzvah. Let me try to demonstrate what I have in mind. The Rambam writes that under the following two conditions, a child could recite Birkas HaMazon on behalf of a gadol. Those two conditions are, number one, that the child ate a meal, which means that the child ate what's called kidei svia or kibetza. And condition number two is that the gadol only ate kizayis. And the Rambam therefore says that in that situation, the child could recite Birkas HaMazon on behalf of the gadol. Now we have a principle that unless two people share the same level of chiyuv, there's no yotza motzi, there's no shomer ka'oneh. If Reuven is chayiv midrabanan and Shimon is chayiv d'oraisa, Reuven cannot be motzi Shimon. Now, the mitzvah Birkas HaMazon is clearly d'oraisa, but the Rambam paskins that the mitzvah d'oraisa of Birkas HaMazon only applies if you ate a kibetza, and a kizayis is only d'rabanan, because kizayis, we paskin like that shita in the Tanoim, is not considered kidei svia, so it's not d'oraisa v'yachalta v'savata uveirachta, but rather d'rabanan. In this case, the child, since he ate a meal, he's chayav in Birkas HaMazon. The child is chayav in Birkas HaMazon. Do you hear this, Rabbosai? This is like mind-boggling, revolutionary. And once the child becomes chayav, again midrabanan, in Birkas HaMazon, he can be motzi a gadol if the gadol only ate kizayis, because in that case the gadol is only chayav midrabanan. And one derabanan, in this case the katan, could be motzi the other derabanan, in the case the gadol who ate kizayis. But Rabbosa, we see something revolutionary here that has to be learned and studied and over again, and that is that a katan becomes a bar chiyuva in Birkas Hamazon. Now, shifting for a moment over to tefillah, the Rambam writes that ketanim chayovim b'tefillah, which means that the katan himself is obligated in tefillah. So imagine the following scenario. If the gadol davened shachris, and therefore he fulfilled his mitzvah min Torah lispalel b'chol yom, now he's up to mincha. His chiyuv to daven mincha, according to everyone, is only d'Rabbanan. Can a katan recite tefillah on behalf of this gadol? Well, the Rambam says that a katan is chayiv in tefillah, which means that the katan is a bar chiyuva. He cannot be motzi a gadol who's chayiv d'oraisa, but in this case, that we downgraded the chiyuv of the gadol from d'oraisa down to d'Rabbanan, the katan shares the same level of chiyuv as the gadol, and he could be motzi the gadol in tefillah. Now, the Rambam doesn't say that anywhere, but I derive that conclusion based on the following two premises. Number one, the Rambam has in Birkas Hamazon explicitly that the katan could be motzi the gadol. And the reason for that, says the Rambam, is because the katan is a bar chiyuv and he's chayiv in Rabbanan in Birkas Hamazon. And point number two, the Rambam holds that tefillah is an obligation on the katan. And therefore I derive by analogy the same conclusion that the katan could be motzi a gadol in tefillah on condition that the gadol is not chayiv midoraisa in tefillah. For example, he already davened that day. Now, the question I want to raise is, if the general rule according to the Rambam is that all mitzvahs of chinuch are clustered together under one rubric, as the Rambam repeats himself over and over again, kidei lechancho b'mitzvah, so there's this general mitzvah chiyuv of chinuch. Why is it that with regard to all the mitzvahs, the katan is not considered a bar chiyuva? He's not chayiv in tzitzis or in tefillin. He's chayiv in chinuch, or more precisely, the father is chayiv in chinuch. For example, the Rambam in tefillin says, aviv konelo tefillin. And in tzitzis, the father has to supply the child with tzitzis. And in the case of aliyah l'regel, the father has to take the child by the hand and climb up to the Har Bayis. And this pattern goes on and on and on. Kidei lechancham b'mitzvahs. There's a mitzvah of chinuch, chanoch lenar al pi darko, which was incumbent by the Rabbanan, was made incumbent on the father. But in these cases of tefillah and Birkas Hamazon, the Rambam has the chiyuv not on the father, but rather on the son. Why was the father removed from the picture? And is it possible, this I'm thinking out loud with you, to suggest that these two mitzvahs are unique? Because the mitzvah is not really the Maisa mitzvah, not the uttering of the words of the grace after meal or the prayer, but rather the mitzvah is belev. It's a mitzvah of kavanas halev. And the Rambam Shita is that a father could not be obligated to educate his son in a mitzvah whose kiyum, meaning the essence of the mitzvah, is kavanas halev. Meaning, if the mitzvah has a whole new dimension to it, it's not like putting on tefillin, putting on tzitzis, on aliyah l'regel, on shaking a lulav. Forget about all those. Those are mitzvahs shebemaisa, and the father is obligated kidei lechancham b'mitzvah in the mitzvah of chinuch to prepare the son for his life as a gadol to implement these maaseh mitzvahs. But the Rabbanan did not impose on the father an obligation of kavanas halev. When the maisa that the child has to do is just a means to an end, it's not an end of it in and of itself. It's not a Maisa mitzvah. I mean, tefillah below kavanah is not worth a dime, and Kriya Shema without Kabbalah Sol Mach Shemaim is not worth anything. In those cases, we say that a katan is a lav bar das, that al pidin he could be as brilliant as the Vilna Gaon at the age of 6, but halachically he's a lav bar das. He does not have, in a legal context, the capacity to implement kavanas halev, or das, and understanding. These are halachic concepts. So you might say, well, he took an IQ test and he's brilliant. He's 11 years old and he scores the highest grades in the whole province, but it doesn't matter. He's a lav bar das. And the Chapsan Afkamina Gabi the mitzvah of chinuch, that the Rambam holds that in the case of das or kavanas halev, the chiyuv of the father now shifts over to the child. Now, you might ask me a question: why is the child obligated? And the answer is because the child has the capacity to create kavanas halev, and I'll prove that to you. For example, the Gemara says in Masechta Brachos Daf Chaf that a woman is obligated in tefillah because tefillah rachmeininu, and she needs rachmim no less than a man. Meaning the obligation is a result of the tefillah itself and its very essence. We'll call it to use a brisker terminology, the chefta shel tefillah. So since a woman, no less than a man, has a chefta shel tefillah, therefore she's obligated in tefillah, albeit not as a mitzvah seishes man groma 3 times a day, but once a day, day and night. Now, if that be the case in Birkas Hamazon, I would insist on the following conclusion, that the katan is capable of having a chefta shel bracha. The bracha of Birkas Hamazon is generated by the child. If it's generated by the child, then the child himself becomes obligated, albeit d'Rabbanan. Let me not repeat that too many times. There's no end to how many times we have to repeat this. But the Rabbanan said that just like in the case of tefillah, a woman is obligated in tefillah, and that's d'oraisa because tefillah rachmeininu, the Rabbanan applied tefillah rachmeininu to the child to obligate the child, midrabbanan, in tefillah, because the child, has a need for rachmei shamayim no less than a gadol. If chas v'shalom, there's some sort of a tsunami, in Venezuela, there's an earthquake, whatever it is, your age is not a factor. You're exposed to the same danger, whether you're a newborn babe or whether you're an 85-year-old man. It doesn't matter. So therefore, the child has rachmeininu, he needs tefillah, and the Rabbanan obligated the child in tefillah. In the case of Birkas Hamazon, the child was obligated in Birkas Hamazon because he has a chefta of bracha. Now, if that be the case, then following that logic to its conclusion, I would insist that in Talmud Torah, the child should be obligated in Talmud Torah. The father might be obligated on a doraisa level based on the pasuk limadatem osam es b'nechem. But as far as chinuch is concerned, the child is a lav bar das. The mitzvah of Talmud Torah is das, and the father therefore is exempt. But the child could create a chefta shel Torah. Now, how do I know that a child could create a chefta shel Torah? I derive this from the Rambam in Hilchos Kriyas HaTorah, which is in Hilchos Tefillah, and the Rambam writes, which is a Gemara in Masechta Megillah, that a katan is ola leminyan shiva, which means that for the 7 korim, technically you could call up a katan. I've never seen it, but I was told that in certain Sephardic communities they actually do this. But be that as it may, it's in the books. The Rambam paskins that a katan is ola leminyan shiva. It could be one of the olim. Now the ola is the one who reads the kriya of that day. I don't mean physically. He may not have to do that. You have a Balkori, but halachically, the Ola is the one who's motzi everyone in the Kriyas HaTorah. And he will make the bracha on the Torah. In the case of a katan, how could he be Ola, Leminyan Shiva? He's not chayev, but the answer is he is chayev. And why is he chayev? Because he has a hefta shel Torah. And if you'd ask me the following, would a katan be allowed to think Torah thoughts in a bathhouse? I would tell you that it's also. Why? Because the katan has a hefta shel Torah. And a hefta shel Torah is antithetical to a bathhouse. We don't bring a hefta shel Torah to a bathhouse. I would even go a step further. Again, I'm not paskening. I'm just telling you according to the logical flow. If a katan was davening, and he's mature enough to understand his davening, it would be prohibited to walk 4 amos in front of the katan. You know, you draw a radius of 4 amos, and in all directions we'll call it a circumference, around the katan, and even if it wouldn't disturb his thoughts, do you follow what I mean? It doesn't disturb his kavan if you go to the side or whatever. Nevertheless, it's also because that area is dedicated to tefillah, to Torah, whatever it might be. Now, if we assume, Rabbosai, that a katan is chayev in Talmud Torah, mirabbanan, and the reason for that is because he has a heftzah shel Torah, so the Rabbanan obligated him in studying of Torah, then what do we do in the case of a father who did not teach his son Torah? Whether he was derelict, he was out there in Medina Sayyam, maybe he's gone already to another world, whatever it might be, the child did not get that chinuch for Talmud Torah from his father. And the child now becomes obligated on his own. And the answer, I believe, is that once he's mature enough, which the Rambam in Halacha Beis, the Rambam Perek Alpha calls Misha Yakir, at that point, Misha Yakir, where he's capable of understanding Torah, he'll have to figure out how to teach himself Torah. And maybe that's where the Rabbanan stepped in with another takana called Takanas Malamde Tinokos, that the Malamdim have to guarantee that the child is taught Torah. In a sense, we circumvent the father, we leave him out of the picture for whatever reason, and now the child, in order to study Torah, the responsibility is sort of placed on the shoulders of the Malamdim, but they are really bringing Torah to the child so that the child can fulfill his personal obligation of Talmud Torah. And if you'll ask me, why would we obligate the child in Talmud Torah? The answer is because the child has a hefta shel Torah. Okay. So this really completes our discussion that we started about a month ago. And now I want to go on to ask the question. So we're starting a whole new, the Etch-a-Sketch, starting a whole new page. What is Mikra? Mem Kuf Reish Aleph. Because the Gemara says in Kiddushin, Ad heichon chayav ha'av l'lamed es b'no Torah, meaning, what's the boundary? What are the boundaries for the father's obligation of Torah? And the Gemara says Mikra. He has to teach his son Mikra. Again, if I had a whiteboard, I'd write that word on the board because that's the word we're going to be focusing our attention on, Mikra, Mem Kuf Reish Aleph. V'eino Malamdo Mishnah. So the father has no obligation to teach his son Mishnah, but rather he's obligated to teach his son Mikra. Rashi says, Ein chovas bino olav ela b'mikra. Okay. So if we want to define the parameters, the hekef, as we call it in Hebrew, of the father's obligation to teach his son Torah, it's mikra. What's mikra? So the Gemara immediately says, Omar Rava, mikra zu Torah. What's that all about? Rashi says, velo neviim uksuvim. Now, anyone here with me today that is a big fan of neviim and ksuvim, I know of one yeshiva here in the Yerushalayim area where they created a whole institute to study neviim and ksuvim. If you go to that yeshiva and you don't learn neviim and ksuvim, you're like considered down there in the dumps. I'm not going to go into detail about how they learn neviim and ksuvim. That's another discussion. But be that as it may, Rashi says that the father does not have to teach his son neviim and ksuvim. Now, watch what happens here. The Gemara opens up the sugya by saying that the father's obligation is mikra, but not mishnah. And Rashi says that there's a gray area in between the two. It's sort of like you have polar extremes. You've got mikra on one hand, you got mishnah on the other hand. The father's obligated in mikra, but not in mishnah. And Rashi breaks through to a middle ground, which he calls neviim and ksuvim. And Rashi says that neviim and ksuvim is not mishnah, and it's not mikra. And Rashi says because it's not mikra, even though it's not mishnah, clearly neviim and ksuvim is not mishnah, and nevertheless the Rashi says that we classify or subsume neviim and ksuvim under mishnah in terms of the father's obligation. In other words, Rashi holds, and unless it's mikra, there's no obligation on the father. And neviim and ksuvim is not mishnah. I'm sorry, start again. And neviim and ksuvim is not mikra. If it's not mikra, then, says Rashi, ipso facto, the father has no obligation. Because Rashi's learning that we're not going to exempt the father when it's mishnah, but rather we're going to exempt the father when it's not mikra. And Rashi differentiates between mikra and neviim and ksuvim. So mikra, according to Rashi, means chamisha chumshei Torah. It does not refer or encompass neviim and ksuvim. And if neviim and ksuvim, argues Rashi, is not included under mikra, then it's not included in the chiv of the father. So we have two halachos, according to Rashi, and they're hab hatalia. One halach is that the father's obligation is exclusively mikra. Anything that's not mikra is outside the purview of the father's obligation. Number two, neviim and ksuvim is not mikra. So we have what's called in fancy logic, it's called modus tollens, right? All S is P, Q is P, and therefore S is P, right? That kind of thing. So if we say the following, the father's obligation is mikra, and then we say that neviim and ksuvim is not mikra, therefore the father is exempt from neviim and ksuvim. That's Rashi's shita. Now I want to share with you an insight into this Rashi based on the writings of Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky. Now, keep in mind, the Emes Yaakov does not address this Rashi. But nevertheless, I think what he writes will give us an insight into this Rashi. So I'm just making sort of like an analogy. And Rav Yaakov writes the following, that the Gemara in Sanhedrin tells us that Ein Shnei Neviim Misnabim B'Signon Echad. Says Rav Yaakov, what does this mean? A Navi receives a tsura. That's Rav Yaakov's language. I personally, I would prefer using a different word. I think what Rav Yaakov has in mind by tzura is a chazon, if you're familiar with that word. Chazon means like an image. In other words, God doesn't talk to any Navi, with the exception of Moshe Rabbeinu, in words. He presents an image, a tzura. And then the Navi has to be motzi es advarim belibo b'dibo. The Navi's obligation and responsibility is to take that chazon and translate it into words. Every Navi has his own style, his own literary style. No two Nevi'im will speak the exact same language, so to speak. I mean, it's all Lashon Kodesh, obviously. Udelo ketoras Moshe, I'm reading from Rav Yaakov, Shemoshe Moshe Advar Mamish Kemoshe Nemru Lo Bar Sinai. In other words, Hashem spoke the words of the Torah, and Moshe committed them to writing without adding or changing anything. It's not Moshe Rabbeinu's style of expression, of nisuach, of formulation, but rather it's Hashem's words. Yotzei, again, I'm reading Rav Yaakov, Nafkamina Gedola Bein Torah, meaning Chamisha Chumshei Torah, Levein Nevi'im Uksuvim. Dibit Torah, Hatevos Kebosha Hein, Torah Hein. Sharei Hein Mamish Divrei Hashem. V'miskayim ha-mitzvah al yidei ha-mikra bilvad. Oh, that's the key word, mikra. Mikra means reading the words is meaningful. And now Rav Yaakov adds, Afilum ene yodea maikol. He doesn't understand what he's reading. Masha enke neviim uksuvim. Again, here Rav Yaakov waxes very flowery, like in a fancy Hebrew. Haloshan hu habas machsheves hanavi. The language and the words are the chosen words of that particular navi. V'alkein. Shalom Mevin Mashu Omer. If you study Nevi'im Eksuva and you understand what the Navi is trying to communicate, Az Makayim mitzvah. He gets a Kiyam mitzvah. Avalim Lo Mevin, if he doesn't understand the words of the Nevi'im and the Ksuvim, Leka Kiyam mitzvah. They kriyas apsukim bilvad. Now, if this be the case, that in Nevi'im Eksuvim, the Navi is transmitting a message, and in order for me to fulfill the mitzvah of Torah, I have to not only read the words of the Navi, but I have to understand the words and the meaning of the words that are being communicated, the message of the words that are being communicated to me from the Navi to me. Then we could begin to understand Rashi. Rashi holds that since Rava said that the father's obligation is only mikra, mikra means kriyas haTorah, without understanding it. Again, if he understands it, matovu manoim, but it's not part of the chiyuv of the father. Says Rashi, therefore, according to Rava, if the father raises the question, do I have to teach my son Nevi'im Uksuvim? The answer is that's not mikra. And the difference is between mikra and Nevi'im Uksuvim is that mikra means kriya without havana, whereas Nevi'im Uksuvim requires Havana. So it's not Mikra. And in that sense, Rashi would subsume Nevi'im Uksuvim under Mishnah. What do I mean Mishnah? Obviously, Nevi'im Uksuvim is not Mishnah. It's Kisvei HaKodesh. But there's one great common denominator, common link between Nevi'im Uksuvim on the one hand and Mishnah on the other. They both require Havana. Without Havana, without understanding it, you miss the point. You miss the boat. Now, where do I come in to the picture? I always like to add something of my own. So I want to suggest, and I say this with trepidation, that the Rambam rejects Rashi in this case. And there's a fundamental plugta between the Rambam and Rashi. And I'm going to argue that according to the Rambam, the father has to teach his son not only Chamisha Chumshei Torah, but also Nevi'im and Ksuvim. And again, as we've said 1,000,001 times, if he can't do it himself, he's got to hire a Malamed. Now, Rabose, just on the side, I have to admit that when I was a child growing up, Nevi'im and Ksuvim was left for like the younger classes, when you got to 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, they taught you a little Nach. And honestly, we didn't take it very seriously. It was like stories, some of them were interesting, some were less interesting. The most interesting stories about David and so forth, they skipped in class. So, of course, we would go home and call up all our friends and read those parts of Tanakh. Anyway, but by the time I got to high school already, who studied Nevi'im and Ksuvim? And when I got to, Beis Medrash age, 18, 19, and so forth, you didn't even know what a Nevi'im and Ksuvim looked like. Was it on the shelves at all? I don't know. Like Tanakh was considered Zionism, I'm exaggerating, but you get the point. But I would like to argue that the Rambam would maintain that the father has an obligation to teach his son Nevi'im and Ksuvim, which would mean that according to the Rambam, when Rava says the father has such and such obligation up to a certain boundary line, but not Mishnah, Nevi'im and Ksuvim are within the purview, the parameters of the father's obligation. And therefore, we have to make a fundamental distinction between Nevi'im and Ksuvim on the one hand and Mishnah on the other hand. Because Rava is outspoken about the fact that the father is exempt from teaching his son Mishnah. And we're going to try to prove in the Rambam that the father is obligated to teach his son not just Chamisha Chumshei Torah, but also Nevi'im and Ksuvim. And therefore, Nevi'im and Ksuvim are fundamentally different than Mishnah. And we'll try to understand how that works. But does everybody follow the framework that I'm trying to create? Again, Roman numeral number 1 is that Rashi interprets Rava, who exempts the father from Mishnah, to likewise exempt the father from Nevi'im and Ksuvim. We tried to explain Rashi's shita based on Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, that Nevi'im and Ksuvim requires Havana, because Ein Shnei Nevi'im, etc., and the Navi is transmitting a message that has to be understood through his words, but there's no inherent significance to the words, as there is in the case of Torah's Moshe, which is Hashem's words, and there's a Kiyum Kriya without Havana. Roman numeral number 2 is we're going to try to suggest that according to the Rambam, the father's obligation extends beyond Chamisha Chumshei Torah, and it encompasses Nevi'im and Ksuvim as well. And then we're going to have to face the music and answer the question, why is Nevi'im and Ksuvim similar to Chamisha Chumshei Torah rather than Mishnah? When, in the light of Rav Yaakov's insights, it doesn't make any sense, because Nevi'im and Ksuvim really belongs conceptually to Mishnah, because it's the Navi transmitting a message. But I'm talking to myself now, Berzon, what leads you to the conclusion that the Rambam disagrees with Rashi? And that the Rambam holds that the chiyuv of the father includes Nevi'im Uksuvim as well. So if you're looking at the pages that David was kind enough to circulate, we're now up to page 2. And page 2 is divided up into 3 parts. Each part is an attempt to prove that the Rambam classifies Nevi'im and Ksuvim together with Mikra within the purview of the father's obligation. Number 1. The Rambam writes, Chayav Adam lelamed es beno ad sheyikra Torah shebechsav kula chaf vav lamed he. Now, my premise when I learn the Rambam is that there's no extra word in the Rambam. What compelled the Rambam to add the word kula? Torah shebechtav kula, the father's obligation is the entirety of Torah shebechsav. So I was perplexed about this. I didn't know what the Rambam meant by kula, my boiler abuye. Like if you're learning the dapim of Daf Yomi and Chulin today, right? It says limi na over and over and over again. The Gemara asks my boiler rabos, what it's coming to be marbe, and there are many different types of chagovim and ofos tmeim and behemos and so forth and so on. So what does the Rambam mean by kula? So the Bach in Yoredeya, Siman Reish Mem He, is medayik from the word kula, hainu lerabos neviim uksuvim. The Shach comes to the exact same conclusion, that the word kula is coming to include neviim uksuvim. Now, in Nevi'im Ksuvim, you have to understand what you're learning. There's no inherent meaning in the words themselves. It's not the word of Hashem, it's the word of the Navi, Ein Shnei Nevi'im, etc. So that's point number one, the word kula, according to the Bach and the Shach. I don't know anyone who disagrees. Point number two. What is the source for what we call takonas molamdin? The takona that there should be in every area, in every vicinity, molamde tinokos. The Gemara says in Baba Basra, mitchila misha yesh lo av molamdo Torah, misha ein lo av lo hayolome Torah. If a person did not have a father, Nebuch, he was a Yosem from his father, or alternatively, his father couldn't teach him anything, he didn't learn Torah. Can you imagine what that means? There was no educational system at all. No Eitz Chaim, no yeshivas, nothing. Hiskidu chachamim, she'moshivim malamdei tanokas b'chol ir ve'ir, b'chol shchunu shchuna, etc., etc. So what do I derive from this Gemara? Before we get to the Rambam, a principle that the purpose, that the underlying goal of Malamde Tinokos is to fill in for the father. You follow this, Rabbosai? Because the father is nowhere to be found. The child is not learning any Torah, so the Malamde Tinokos are there to fill in for the gap, right? Like if you ever use the underground in London, right? Mind the gap. There's a gap. There's a gap here because the child doesn't have a father to teach him. We have to supply a father. And the Bimkom father who's fulfilling the obligation that normally would have been fulfilled by the father is the Malame Tinokos. Now watch this. The Rambam writes the following. Perik Beis Halacha Vav. Molichem es hakatan mimalamed limalamed acher. Now, I'll give a little bit of an introduction here. The Rambam wants to know if, let's say, I live in Ontario, let's say, but I hear that there's a better Malamed in Quebec. Okay, that's a very extreme case because how are you going to get from there to there? But let's say we'll divide up Toronto into various neighborhoods, right? So the Rambam says that the father has the right to take the child out of one Malamed, out of the jurisdiction of one Malamed, and bring him to another Malamed. Why? What's the matir, to allow, to permit the father to do so, and maybe even obligate the father to do so. Shehu, because the second Melamed, Mahir Mimenu, Mahir means he's more professional, he's more successful, he's more of an expert than the first Melamed. Bein b'mikra, ubein b'digduk. There are two words here in the Rambam that are totally superfluous. The Rambam says that Melamed Beis, to whom the father wants to transfer his child, is superior to Melamed Aleph, where the child is now currently. Number one, b'mikra, das verstehe. And now the Rambam says bein b'digduk. Now, digduk may be grammar. Hebrew grammar, like any language, grammar is a pain in the neck. But I looked into the Mefarshim, and nobody seems to say that the Rambam in the word digduk is referring to grammatical digduk. So, for example, I'll quote to you the Netziv Mi Valozhin, and you'll see it in the pages I gave it to you. He writes that digduk means Havanas HaMikra. Now, watch what's going on over here. I'm again creating a molus tollus. I'm putting in logical principles and adding them all together. Principle number one is that the father is obligated to teach his son Mikra. Principle number two is that in event that the father is not doing so, then the Melamed is going to do so on behalf of the father. Rule number three is that the Melamed's obligation includes not just reading the Mikra, but as the Netziv calls it, Pirush HaMikra, to explain the Mikra. That's Havodas HaMikra. So the father is going to take his child out of the first Melamed, bring him to the second Melamed, because the Melamed is superior to the second Melamed, is superior to the first Melamed in both Mikra and Digduk, which, according to the Netziv, is the Pirush HaMikra. So it's not just that the Melamed, as the agent of the father, is teaching Mikra without any Havana, but rather he's teaching the Psukim and the explanation of the Psukim. And honestly, intuitively, I say that's got to be right. Do you follow what I mean? Imagine taking your child to a Melamed, and again, he's breaking your teeth, and the child is learning, to read Psukim like a Tuki by rote. I'd rather take him to a Melamed who's going to explain the Psukim. So from the fact that the Rambam speaks about the second Melamed as bein b'mikro, bein b'digduk, which the Netziv says digduk means havanas hapsukim, I understand that the Rambam wants to add havana into the obligation of the father against Rashi. Rashi says it's only mikra, because Rashi holds that Nevi'im Uksuvim really come under Mishnah because you have to understand what the Navi is telling you. But the Rambam is saying that Mikra includes understanding the Psukim. And if that be the case, then Nevi'im Uksuvim, I want to understand what the Navi is telling me. I have to understand the Psukim. And the Chiyuv of the father and vicariously the Melamed is to teach Havanas HaMikra, which could apply to all of Nevi'im Uksuvim as well, just as it applies to Chamisha Chumshei Torah. So now what comes into sharp perspective here, according to the Rambam, is the contrast between Mikra and Mishnah. In the case of Mikra, which includes also Tosha B'Chsav, the father's obligation is to teach not only the Kriya, but also the Pirush HaMilos. Mishnah already introduces a whole nother part of Torah, a whole nother discipline, which we call Torah Sheba'al Peh, in which there are no words. The words are only there, to analyze the words of the Torah. But the Torah itself includes Nevi'im Ksuvim. And finally, and with this we'll conclude for today, I think I found a third proof that the Rambam holds that the father's obligation includes understanding the psukim, and therefore, ipso facto, Nevi'im Ksuvim. The Rambam writes in the very next halacha, we're up to halacha Vav, but in halacha Zayin, the Rambam addresses the question of whether or not the Melamed is allowed to receive a salary for teaching Torah. And the Rambam derives from Moshe Rabbeinu that teaching Torah does not permit you to get paid for teaching Torah, because the pasuk says, "Ani re'ei limaditi eschem chukim u'mishpatim." And the Gemara says that Moshe Rabbeinu taught chukim u'mishpatim, and he did not get paid for it. It was voluntary. Maybe he was past retirement age. I don't know. Forced retirement. So Moshe Rabbeinu got no salary for teaching chukim u'mishpatim. Now, Rav Yosef Karo, in his great work called the Beit Yosef, again in Yoredei Siman Reish Mem Hey, which I quoted earlier, says that the obligation of the father, I'll read to you his language. Mashma leila Rambam, the keva de muto lito schar al mikra im kain chai v'lamdo b'schar. Whether or not the father's obligation includes paying a salary to a Melamed depends upon the question of whether or not the Melamed is allowed, he's permitted to take payment. The Rambam says that you can't take payment for teaching chukim u'mishpatim. Now watch what's going on over here. Chukim u'mishpatim requires havana. When Moshe Rabbeinu is teaching chukim mishpatim, he's not teaching words. He's not teaching, how to pronounce and mimic like a parrot words. He's teaching concepts. Chukim u'mishpatim. And he's not allowed to get paid for that. Says the Beit Yosef, the father's obligation extends and includes up to the point of chukim mishpatim, meaning as long as the Melamed is allowed to get paid, then the father is obligated to pay in the context of his mitzvah of limadim osam es b'nechem. So that means that at what point do we remove the father and absolve him from his obligation? At the point of chukim u'mishpatim. It would seem then that as far as teaching Torah, and for that matter, even Havanas HaTorah and Pirush HaMikros, the Melamed is allowed to get paid. It's not chukim mishpatim. And therefore we cannot derive from Moshe Rabbeinu any sort of prohibition. And then the Beis Yosef says, therefore the father is obligated. So the father's obligation extends to pay for a Melamed, to teach whatever the Melamed is permitted to get paid for. So we're going to define the obligation and the scope of the obligation of the father by whether or not there's a heter to pay or not a heter to pay. And apparently there is a heter to pay someone, not just to teach the mikra as a sense of kriya, but even to teach the Pirush HaMikra, and that's also included on the Mikra. And the obligation of the father terminates when the Melamed is not allowed to take money, which means chukim mishpatim. And if that be the case, then even having granted the premise, and it's a very solid premise of Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, that Nevi'im Ksuvim requires Havanas HaMikra, because the Nevi'im are trying to convey a message, nevertheless, you're allowed to pay someone to teach Nevi'im Ksuvim with the pirush of the words, and to understand the message that's being conveyed by the Navi. that's within the parameters of heter, because it's not re'eh limadati oschem chukim u'mishpatim. When we get to chukim mishpatim, which is Torah Sheba'al Peh, that has no connection to any particular mikra, then at that point, there's an Isser, a prohibition that we derive from Moshe Rabbeinu not to accept payment, and then the Beis Yosef says ipso facto, the father is exempt. So just to summarize, and now I'll let you go, there are three, in my humble opinion, three proofs to establish that the Rambam would extend the father's obligation of Mikra to include Nevi'im Uksuvim against Rashi. And I looked and I searched and I didn't find anything or anybody who would say this except in remez form, it's sort of like by intimating in the Bach and the Shach that the Rambam would hold Melamed. What was the language again? Ad sheyikra Torah shebechsav kula, and the Rambam in kula meant to add Nevi'im Uksu. Okay, then Rabbosai, so we'll stop here. I wish you a meaningful fast, and it goes without saying that you got to turn on the air conditioning. The heat is just terrible. I mean, here it's lovely, but it's a good. There are two basic reasons at this point to encourage you to make Aliyah from Canada. One reason starts with a ches, and the other starts with a ches. The one that starts with the ches is called Hamas. At least here we're fighting against Hamas. And the second ches is Chom. Normally it's freezing in Canada. And that's a reason to make Aliyah. But of course, we're all involved in too many things in Canada. Oh, Canada. Today's Canada Day, so we really salute Canada, which in the past has been a great place for the Jews. Anyway, let's just hope that Nefesh B'Nefesh will continue its great work.
All right.
So have a meaningful... Oh, Yudi, just one last question. Can we say Shechiyanu today for the special holiday of today?